Our question today from one of our Patreon supporters is from Sarah. The question is in general about non-traditional women, but I use myself as an example. I studied electrical engineering and now run a team of machine learning, engineering, and data science in a big tech company. I'm very left brain, but I don't feel masculine at all. When I was doing undergraduate work in Iran, I didn't feel out of place, since over there stereotypes around women in technical fields were not as strong as here. Then I immigrated, started graduate school, and started hearing all sorts of strange comments from people when they learned what I was studying. When I was finishing my PhD, my hostile male lab mate, who was now finally my friend, said the first time he saw me, he thought I would turn out to be a moron. By that time, I had heard enough to think, well, that's why Western women shy away from engineering. The silly comments I hear now, they hear since early childhood. And now, as an engineer in Silicon Valley, it is even more confusing. To the eyes of the outside world, I must be a masculine woman. I can't be feminine enough. I can't be a good mother, must have neglected my kids, etc. Then at work, I constantly have to prove myself. I've had a dozen of male bosses so far, all of them less skilled and less qualified than myself, who for the first few months were biased towards my male counterparts until I proved myself to each one of them all over again. I have changed jobs a few times, and the same story with having to prove myself harder than my less skilled male counterparts, etc. In summary, outside of work, we can't be good enough or feminine enough as women and mothers, and at work we can't be good enough engineers, can't have strong logical minds, or can't have good enough left brains. I think even Tom in his trilogy mentioned something about how logic is not easily accessible by womankind. So, given the challenges that non-traditional women face and the intimidating beliefs that we ingrain into little girls, is it helpful to keep going back and saying, a million years ago, women used to hide in caves? Does defining gender always have to reinforce beliefs in stereotypes that cause limitations and prejudice towards women?
Okay, well, good question. And Sarah, you, along with probably millions of other bright young feminine women, have this problem in our culture. My wife, Pamela, had the same sort of thing. It happened to her all the time. There'd be some problem they were discussing at work, and she was she had her PhD in systems engineering, and she had her undergraduate degree in physics. And she'd come up with a solution to the problem, and this would be in a staff meeting, and the boss would just stop, wouldn't say anything for a while. Then some guy would come up and repeat what she said almost word for word, and he'd say, "Oh, a great idea. Thank you, James." And it just happened to her over and over again. Yes, that is the culture. And, there's nothing really that's going to fix that culture except time and people like yourself. But there's no, there's no excuse for it. Things like that, they're just generally bad behavior. It's prejudice, like any prejudice. It's indicates a lower quality of consciousness. It indicates an ability to not be able to think for yourself, but rather just carry along thinking that comes out of 200 or 300 years ago. And you're still kind of stuck in those old ways of seeing the world and can't get out from under them. Don't realize that these facts are not facts at all. They're just beliefs. Well, we're changing that. And hopefully you've seen it over, sounds like you've been doing this for some years. Hopefully you've seen it getting better, at least a little bit, and some companies being much better than others at that. There'll be some companies you might get in where you don't have that problem at all, and others where you have a great deal of trouble. So it just depends on the openness and how grown up your boss is and your coworkers, whether they carry this prejudice with them or not. It's just a simple prejudice. It's a belief in something they think is true because that's what their culture told them that this was true. It's a great disservice to women. It's a great disservice even to the work that gets done. You know, the world would be much better off if we allowed females to be both technically competent and feminine. There's nothing there that one does not negate the other. That's again just a prejudice that we have. And as you know, from culture to culture, prejudices come and go. You may find some cultures that don't have that at all. You may find other cultures that have even worse prejudices. So it's a cultural thing. Culture is basically groupthink or collective consciousness. So it's ideas that probably started hundreds of years ago and have been passed along through the culture and are changing. So that's the good news. It's not like we're stuck with this forever. But there was a big turnaround or a big change in male-female relationships in the workplace about 200 years ago or so, 150 years ago. And then we got to World War II and it accelerated. And we've been seeing those changes. Books have been written about them. People have talked about them. Many women have experienced them, and it has gotten better. It's not as bad as it was if you were 50 years ago doing the same thing, you would have found it even worse. And hopefully 50 years from now, those young women that follow you will find it much better. So I think we are in a process of changing, but to change a cultural belief just takes time.
About 50 years ago, Sandra Day O'Connor, one of the justices of the Supreme Court, graduated with honors from Stanford Law School and could only find a job as a legal secretary.
Mm-hmm.
High ranking in her class. So that
Yeah.
that was present there. But I know your book, Primal Male, Primal Female, is pointing out the instincts that existed at a time when people needed to survive and women had just a role for survival's sake. But how do we break out of those inherent ingrained instincts that we have to allow more um, equality for women?
Yeah.
Because
Well, there's a couple of ways. And one is not by erasing the past. You can't go back and say, well, yes, I talk about at a time when we were probably dragging our knuckles on the ground and everybody lived in caves and things, that life was very rough and very violent, and the value that was placed on those who could reproduce, the females, and our species had a strategy for survival which had males and females not all doing the same things, but we learned to do different things to help the survival. That was the big difference between us and Neanderthal. In Neanderthal skeletons, the males and females are not quite as different as they are in Homo sapiens. They're more roughly the same size. Males are still a little larger, but not by so much. And that's true in many of the primates. The males and the females are about the same size and so on. So we humans, we Homo sapiens, did things a little differently. And these differences are still with us. And it doesn't do us any good to deny that all that happened and that's the roots that we come from. Yes, we come from these roots. But guess what, people? The environment has changed a whole lot. What was really good and smart for the environment then is not so smart for the environment now. So it takes time to change, but it also takes a will to change. And that can be helped by, I think, doing a couple of things. One, people like you who are young, attractive females who go out in the world and show that they can be smart, that they can be sharp, that they can contribute as much as any male can contribute, that there's no handicap in being young and pretty and also an engineer, that those things can all work together. They're not mutually exclusive. So just being the proof of it means that these women will have to suffer the prejudice, but they will be the ones changing things. And though you may not have noticed change, just the places where you have been and where you have worked probably did change a little just because you were there. Maybe not a great amount, but they changed somewhat. And the women that come in behind you will make them change a little bit more, and so on. So that's one thing. Let's encourage our girls to be whatever they want to be. If they want to be engineers or physicists or astronauts or housewives or whatever it is they aspire to, let's encourage them to do that. And the more our society sees it, recognizes it, it will become mundane and everyday, and pretty soon that prejudice is going to melt away. So it's not something that'll be there forever, but it does take time to move a culture. Cultures just don't change in a few decades. They take a long time. So the second thing, besides actually being there and showing up and being an example of a smart, attractive woman, in a very highly technical position, the other thing is education. We can talk about it. We can write books about it. The Primal Man, Primal Woman is going to be one of those books that talks about that and talks about what a bad idea, prejudice is. So, and about the changes in our environment, and they require changes in the way we interact, the way we see others, but also that we have instincts and we don't want to get crosswise with our instincts. There's no reason why a young woman cannot be feminine, even extremely feminine, and extremely good at a highly technical job. There's no inconsistency, or one doesn't prohibit the other. You should be able to be very feminine and very technical and be taken seriously.
It's
So,
interesting that you brought up that crossways with instincts, because that's exactly what I've written down here just before you spoke it. Could it be more than just prejudice? A young woman comes in to a new office environment, and is that primal instinct that is crossways with
sure.
how they perceive this person? It's kind of and and interestingly, she worked through that because of her brilliance and her ability. They accept good work. Men tend to do that. They recognize good work and they lose that fear, because that instinct is a primal fear, I'm thinking
Well,
of.
it's not so much a fear as it is, instincts are there for two reasons. One is to help us survive. Well, both of them are to help us survive as a species. Instincts are created by the pressures of the environment and the pressures around uh, survival of the species. And that means our instincts center around two things. And that's, having more humans, procreating, and surviving, not being killed. Those are the two things that make a species go forward in time rather than become extinct in time. So we have these if you will, hardwired attitudes that have helped us survive and procreate. So we have those, and if we just try to ignore those and say, well, they don't really exist, and I'm just going to ignore those, then that is not a good thing. You can't ignore what is fundamentally hardwired in you. Otherwise, it'll make you uncomfortable with yourself. It'll make you neurotic. It'll make you unhappy. I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member, because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you. We have to learn to get along with those instincts. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be ruled by your instincts. You can always tell your instinct to sit down and be quiet. This is not appropriate now, here. So you can bring your instincts up short and compel them to work more to the favor of the environment you find now. And that's okay. But if you just try to deny them like they're not there or they're a bad thing, then that creates a problem. If you say, okay, they're there and they're a part of me and that's part of the way I am, but I'm not going to let them get in the way of, who I am, what I'm doing, my integrity, and this and that and the other thing. So that's important. The thing I think will help most is education. I think that is going to be a big thing, but it's like any prejudice. We have a trouble in this country with racism as well, and we have a bigger problem with racism than, say, England does, because England didn't have their economy based on slavery for a few centuries like we did. So they didn't build up all that problem in history. So all the cultures are different, but our culture needs to grow up and accept females as part of the workplace, and not females have to act like men to be accepted in the workplace, because females bring a different attitude, a different way of looking at things, a different way of thinking, of solving problems. They bring more intuition into the workspace. They tend to, bring their own point of views there, and that's valuable. That's very valuable to the workspace. And we don't do that now. We say, okay, ladies, you're welcome to come into the technical workspace, but you got to act like men. You got to pretend to be a man. And, that just isn't helpful. So we've grown up a little. We've invited women into the workspace. Companies do hire female engineers and female scientists and so on. But we don't really openly embrace them being feminine and being female. We want them to act more like men. And if they act more like men, then we expect them to be more like men. And then we kind of give them men's attitudes toward things. And all of that is very false. They're not like that. So I think that's the next big step. The first big step was to invite them into the workplace to begin with. Well, we're about 100 years into that and still working on it, obviously. The next big step is to not only invite women into work, but invite them to bring their female perspectives and attitudes and thinking processes with them, and to embrace those ideas, those prospects, those different ways of seeing the problem. Females tend to be more people-oriented. Males tend to be more stuff-oriented. And if you're in an engineering profession, you have to worry about the people side of it. That's not an invisible side. If your designs and so on are not people-friendly or user-friendly or even repair-friendly, then they're not good designs. And women are more likely to solve those kinds of problems than they are, is it strong enough? Is it resilient enough? They can work on that too, but men and women just see the world a little differently. And the things that women bring are valuable. The things that men bring are valuable. So I think that's the next big step, is inviting the whole woman into the workplace, not just the woman who can act like a man, but the woman who can be very feminine and still be embraced with her ideas and her contribution to the workplace. So it's a work in progress. And depending on the amount of education we can do, again, just like racism, one of the big things that helped reduce racism in this country was Martin Luther King. And he was an educator. He was not just an advocate for Blacks, he was an advocate for people. He didn't talk about, I have a dream where Black people have a bigger slice of the pie. He said, I have a dream where Black people and white people work together for mutual success.
Yes.
You see, so that's a difference. He came in not wanting to right prejudice just by itself. He wanted to unite the people so that they could all appreciate the skills and the ideas and the feelings and the value that everybody brings. And we need to do that now with gender as well. Okay, so
So
that was,
we'll
yeah, so
take
that,
women out of the caves and into the office. Is that how your book
yeah,
will progress? Okay.
exactly. My
Okay.
book will be all in favor of that progression,
Okay.
and it'll say why that yes, women don't belong in caves anymore. Before, the species surviving, that was a significant part of it. We don't live in that world anymore. The constraints have changed, so we need to change, and having women share not only their left brain skills, but their femaleness as well to the job, including the engineering job. That will be a big improvement, but that's
That's
going
a
to,
wonderful idea
yeah,
because I
but
know Pamela has such great intuition, and in her leadership programs, she
mhm,
is unbeatably uh, good at that.
yeah,
So
so it's different. Women bring a little different thinking process to it, and everything has its people side. Everything has its technical side, and women can do both. They can be probably more aware than the men of the people side of things, making things fit, making things user friendly, making things more able to be repaired. Thinking about how do the people interact with this thing I'm designing or I'm making, and they would have more of a tendency to think about those things than would the male engineers. The male engineers are probably more inclined to think about, how much did it cost? How much does it weigh? What's the tensile strength? What's this? What's the job it has to get done? And not think too much about the people's lives that they're disrupting or creating more difficulty for, or so on. So now here I'm just generalizing. It's not that all women are like this or all men are like that. There are women across the whole spectrum and there are men across the whole spectrum. But just looking at kind of the fat part of the curve, women bring some unique insights to the workplace. And that includes the very most technical work that we do. And those are not appreciated right now. It's only appreciated if they work like men, think like men, act like men, and then they kind of get treated like fake men, which is not treated very well at all. They're not fake men. They're women and should be embraced as that and use those skills, those attitudes that are missing. A great deal of the failures in our design are because the people sides of it are left out. The machine isn't easy to repair, isn't easy to assemble, isn't made to last a long time. All the things that irritate people when they deal with machines. You know, a woman would be more likely to see that and advocate for those kinds of things in their design which making our things more people friendly. That's a huge part of engineering that needs to be improved. A lot of our stuff is not very people friendly. It's made just to do the job, and the people have to adjust themselves to get that job done. And that's not good engineering. Good engineering realizes those tools are going to be used by people, and they need to take that into account. So, yes, women need to move into these spaces, and they need to maintain their femininity. And they need to just keep hammering at it, even though they run into this prejudice. And slowly they will, through their own examples and through education. So it's like my book is going to also talk about these ideas, and so will other people. These ideas will gain steam, and more people will get behind them when the average quality of consciousness rises up. This is what you see when you see a bigger picture. When you see little pictures, you see, males and females as kind of separate in every way. They can't do the same work. They can't, they're just too different. And that's not the case. We have lots of, there are no limits on either gender. Gender doesn't come with intellectual limits. The intellectual limits are there, but it does come with different viewpoints and different attitudes and different ways of communicating and seeing the world. And to get as much variation there as possible, you're going to get a better product. You want variation. You don't want just sameness. You don't want all the same kind of people with the same thoughts, making your tools and making your devices. You want to have as much diversity invested in those products as possible, because then they will tend to be better products, the more diversity they have involved in them. So
It's a
that's
good
where
plan.
that's where we're going. But unfortunately, it's going to take some time to get there. And this country maybe is going to take a little longer. But as other places get better, we will too. And we may not be leaders in cultural growing up, but we can grow up culturally, and we have been growing up culturally. If you go back 200 years, things were a whole lot worse than they are now. We've made a lot of progress. So
There were
keep
very
working.
progressive women 200 years ago too. Many, not a lot of them, but many of the fine writers were very, very much out of the norm. We have to remember too, now coming from your viewpoint, there's no gender in consciousness. When we sign on to this free will awareness unit, this free will awareness unit signs on to the avatar, rather, um, we take on the challenge of working through with our consciousness the tendencies and the attributes of that gender. So that's just another way to
Absolutely right.
challenge us, I imagine.
Yeah. Conscious has no gender, but male and female work terrifically together. One of them tends to fill in where the other one has weakness, and the other fills in where that one has weakness. And we tend to work good, and we tend to make good teams. But our culture has to grow up a little bit more before they will be aware of that. And just keep slogging it out and keep pointing out what you can contribute. And there's not much else you can do. Encourage more females to embrace traditionally male areas, and more males to embrace traditionally female areas. There's my little grandson, who almost didn't survive an illness, was born with just about 30% of his diaphragm. I stayed in the hospital, and so did my daughter and son-in-law. We and my wife, we stayed there for many hours. And from all of our viewpoints, the best nurse he had in that NICU, which was the neonatal intensive care, was a male, was a young man. He was really, really gentle, tender, caring. All the nurses were good, but he was exceptional. And it was a he. You say, so you get this variation both ways. So I would encourage men to follow whatever their dream is and go do it and do it well. And same with females. And all of you managers out there who manage things, wake up. You know, you need to see the world as it is, not as you were told it was by your culture. You need to get rid of your biases, of your prejudice. Those things just make your products worse, make your relationships with your people worse. So it's just a problem to get over. So education and demonstration, well, and by demonstration, I mean going out into the workplace and just being who you are and letting people deal with that. That takes courage. It's very exhausting, but one day it will pay off. And you know, just as the black people have to deal with white racism, and they deal with it every day, and they have to deal with it particularly with their young black boys. But you can't quit or feel beaten or kind of go hide. You have to deal with these things. You have to change them. You have to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And hats off to those people who have the courage to do that, because it's good for all of us. So I guess that's mostly what I'd want to say about that. Just keep on keeping on. You will find your reward eventually. And
Thank
thank
you.
you. And thank you for helping be one of those forces of change.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that question to light and your experience. Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks, Tom.